Welcome to The Adventure of the Politician's Pollen, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Holmes and the New Century, the Edwardian Enigmas, playing in the year 1907. My unpublished notes, intended for a biography I never completed, were only recently rediscovered. They form a chronicle of Mr. Sherlock Holmes as he confronted the challenges of the burgeoning Edwardian age. With Dr. Watson increasingly occupied, it fell to me, then a young journalist, to document the singular cases involving new technologies and shifting social mores that marked Holmes's work in a rapidly modernizing London. The first of these adventures I shall recount is a most peculiar affair that baffled Scotland Yard entirely, a matter I have called The Adventure of the Politician's Pollen. Chapter 1. The November morning had dawned with a particularly dispiriting gloom, and a thick yellow fog swirled about the window panes of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street. The muffled rumble of carriage wheels on the damp cobbles below was the only sound to disturb the peace, save for the steady ticking of the mantel clock and the soft hiss of the gaslight. I had laid aside my paper and observed my companion, who paced back and forth before the fire like a caged tiger, his hands clasped behind him and his hawk-like features drawn into a frown of intense concentration. "Another chemical experiment, Holmes," Dr. John Watson said. He stopped his restless march and shot me a glance. "On the contrary, Watson, I am suffering from an acute attack of ennui. The criminal classes of London have grown maddeningly dull. Without a problem, my mind stagnates. It is a terrible thing to feel one's faculties rust from disuse," declared Sherlock Holmes. To distract him, I picked up the morning's edition of the Daily Telegraph once more. Its pages crackled audibly as I unfolded them. Well, the papers are certainly full of excitement, if not of the criminal sort. They are all ablaze with this business concerning Miss Eleanor Vance, the suffragette. It seems she was taken violently ill during her address at Caxton Hall last night. Some are crying foul play," asked Dr. John Watson. "Ah, yes, the political firebrand. I saw the headline. A case of nerves, no doubt, brought on by an excess of public shrieking," remarked Sherlock Holmes. His tone was dismissive, but I saw his eyes flicker with a momentary interest. Before I could press the point, a sudden heavy pounding of footsteps echoed from the 17 steps that led to our door. They were steps I knew well, hurried, heavy-footed, and full of an impatient energy. "That will be our friend from Scotland Yard. Lestrade is in a state of some agitation, if I am any judge of a man's tread. Show him in, Watson." A moment later, the door flew open to admit the ferret-faced inspector. His coat was damp from the fog, and his breath came in short, sharp bursts. "Holmes, thank heavens you're in. I've a cab waiting. It's a bad business, a very bad business indeed," Inspector Lestrade answered. "Compose yourself, Lestrade, and take a seat. I presume this concerns the unfortunate collapse of Miss Eleanor Vance," replied Sherlock Holmes. Lestrade stopped short, his mouth agape. "How in thunder did you know that?" responded Inspector Lestrade. "The splash of mud on your left trouser leg is of a reddish-brown clay unique to the grounds near Westminster. You are flustered, which suggests a case of public importance. And you have come directly to me, which means the Yard is utterly baffled. The only event of note in that vicinity to confound the official force is the sudden illness of a prominent public figure. The conclusion is elementary, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Lestrade grumbled under his breath, but sank into the armchair I offered him. Baffled is the word, Holmes. The doctors can find no trace of poison, yet they swear her symptoms are consistent with it. She collapsed mid-speech, gasping for air. With Lord Harrington Cole making threats against her in Parliament only last week, every paper in London is screaming assassination. We need you. Scotland Yard needs you, responded Inspector Lestrade. Holmes's lethargy had vanished entirely. His eyes shone with that peculiar light I had come to associate with the start of a new hunt. He leaned forward, his long, thin fingers steepled before him. A poison that is not a poison. A political motive that is almost too obvious. This presents features of considerable interest. Watson, your hat and coat. Lestrade, lead the way. We shall proceed to Caxton Hall at once, observed Sherlock Holmes. Our hansom cab rattled over the slick cobblestones of Westminster, depositing us before the imposing stone facade of Caxton Hall. Far from being deserted, the hall was a hive of police activity. Uniformed constables guarded the doors, and inside the cavernous main chamber buzzed with the low murmur of official inquiry. The air, thick with the scent of dust and damp wool, was charged with a palpable tension, though the faint, lingering aroma of tea still hung in the background. "Ah, Holmes, good of you to come, though I dare say we have the matter well in hand," Inspector Lestrade replied. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard emerged from the gloom of a side corridor, his small, ferret-like features alight with a self-satisfied confidence. He bustled towards us, his boots squeaking a rhythm of official importance on the polished floorboards. She collapsed right here on the dais, gave a fiery speech, sat down for a cup of tea provided by the committee, and then within minutes she was gasping for air. A dreadful business. But we have our man, Inspector Lestrade answered. Indeed, your celerity is to be commended, Lestrade. Pray, who is this culprit? Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes's voice was deceptively mild, but his keen grey eyes were already sweeping the room, missing nothing from the water carafe on the speaker's lectern to the arrangement of chairs upon the stage. Lord Harrington Cole, he's been her most vocal opponent in Parliament, made no secret of his disdain for the entire suffrage movement. He was in the front row, staring her down the entire time. Motive, opportunity, it's as plain as the nose on your face, Inspector Lestrade said. Ignoring the inspector's pronouncement, Holmes ascended the few steps to the small stage. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his gaze finally settling upon a small table where a porcelain tea service sat, seemingly undisturbed. He bent low, his hawk-like profile silhouetted against the hall's tall, grimy windows. "And the poison? What have the doctors determined?" replied Sherlock Holmes. Lestrade shifted his weight, his confident tone faltering for the first time. "Well, that is the sticking point. They can find no trace of any known substance. But a man like Harrington Cole would have access to all manner of obscure compounds from the Orient, no doubt," responded Inspector Lestrade. Holmes made a small, impatient sound and picked up the teacup from which Miss Vance had presumably drunk. He produced his powerful pocket lens, angling the cup to catch what little light penetrated the hall. The low hum of activity in the room seemed to fade away as he focused, the world narrowing to that single piece of porcelain in his hand. "Watson, come here, tell me what you see," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. I stepped forward and peered into the delicate cup. At the very bottom, clinging to the last few drops of cold tea, was a fine reddish-brown dust, almost like brick dust or paprika. "I cannot say for certain, Holmes. It appears to be mere sediment, perhaps from the bottom of a tea-caddy," Dr. John Watson commented. "Sediment, of course! You're chasing shadows, Holmes, while our man is likely destroying evidence. We are wasting valuable time on trifles," replied Inspector Lestrade. Holmes straightened up, and his voice, when he spoke, cut through the inspector's bluster with the sharp precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Lestrade, everything is a trifle until it is proved otherwise. Observe that this powder is not suspended in the liquid, nor is it a simple residue left by evaporation. It is a distinct deposit. It is granular, and it is a colour I do not associate with any blend of tea grown in India or Ceylon. This is no trifle. This, I suspect, is the very heart of the matter," Sherlock Holmes noted. With immense care, he tipped the contents of the cup into a clean envelope from his pocket, folded it, and placed it securely in his breast pocket. He turned to me, his eyes alight with the fire of a new and intriguing problem. "Lord Harrington Cole and his political squabbles are a distraction. We must go to the source. Our investigation begins not with the suspect, but with the victim. Come, Watson, we shall pay a visit to Miss Eleanor Vance." The cab ride from Caxton Hall was a silent affair, save for the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the occasional splash on the damp cobblestones. Holmes was lost in one of his profound reveries, his long fingers steepled before him, his gaze fixed upon the grey London streets rushing by. He clutched the small folded paper containing the curious reddish dust as if it were a holy relic. Our destination was a respectable but unassuming townhouse in Bloomsbury, the residence of the very woman whose near demise was the talk of the city. A solemn maid admitted us, the latch clicking softly behind us, into a hallway that smelled of beeswax and determined resolve. Stacks of pamphlets and political journals rested on every available surface, their pages whispering as a draught slipped under the door. We were shown into a sitting-room where Miss Eleanor Vance was propped against a mountain of pillows on a chaise longue. She was pale, and her breathing still seemed laboured, but the fire in her eyes was undimmed. It was the gaze of a commander who had been wounded in battle, but had no intention of surrendering. "So, you are the famous Mr. Holmes. I confess I did not expect Scotland Yard to seek your particular talents for a matter of simple political thuggery," said Miss Eleanor Vance. Her voice was raspy, yet each word was delivered with the precise articulation of a seasoned orator. "That is precisely why I am here, Miss Vance. I suspect this affair is anything but simple. The police look for a man with a vial, whereas I am looking for a man with a grievance and a most peculiar knowledge," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He took a seat opposite her, his manner direct, entirely devoid of the usual bedside pleasantries. "Pray, describe for me the moments leading to your collapse." Ignore what you believe happened, and tell me only what your senses perceived." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Miss Vance narrowed her eyes, but seemed to recognize the utility of his command. She took a shallow breath, a faint whistle accompanying the effort. It was sudden. One moment I was speaking, the next my throat felt as if it were closing. My eyes burned and streamed with tears, and a terrible tightness seized my chest. It was a desperate, violent battle for air. I have suffered from hay fever in the country, Mr. Holmes. This was like that, but magnified 1,000-fold. A monstrous, instantaneous assault, responded Miss Eleanor Vance. A shiver ran through her, a memory of the body's betrayal. She gathered herself and leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "There is no mystery here. Lord Harrington Cole has publicly sworn to halt our campaign by any means. He calls us a shrieking horde, a blight on the nation. He stood not 20 feet from me. He is a brute, and he is your man," answered Miss Eleanor Vance. "His motive is certainly clear, and his opportunity undeniable. Yet the method you describe does not smack of a brute. It is subtle. It mimics nature," declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes rose, the springs of his chair sighing in protest, and began to pace the small room, the floorboards groaning softly beneath his restless stride. He paused by the window, his gaze fixed upon the dreary street where the distant hiss of a gas lamp could just be heard, lost in thought. "Your doctors found no trace of aconite, of arsenic, of any known poison. Lestrade is baffled. But what if the agent was not a poison in the conventional sense? What if it was something intended to turn your own body against you? Something carried not in a liquid, but on the very air you breathed," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He turned back towards us, his expression animated with the thrill of the chase. He tapped the breast pocket where the paper envelope resided. "The police may seek a chemist, but I believe we should be looking for a gardener, or perhaps a botanist with a grudge. Your accusation against Lord Harrington Cole is most compelling, Miss Vance, and must be pursued," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Leaving the impassioned suffragette to her recovery, we made our way back into the London mist. The silence between us was profound, broken only by the rattle of a passing omnibus, as I pondered Miss Vance's conviction and Holmes's quiet intensity. It was some moments before Holmes finally spoke, his voice crisp with decision. "A direct accusation from the victim cannot be ignored, Armitage. The man's politics are abhorrent and his temper infamous. Tomorrow we shall pay a visit to this lion in his den. It is time we heard Lord Harrington Cole roar for himself," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The hansom cab rattled over the cobblestones of Westminster, the grand facade of the Houses of Parliament looming through the grey London mist. Miss Vance's conviction had been absolute. Her finger pointed squarely at the man we were now to interview, Lord Harrington Cole. His offices were not far from the seat of power he so jealously guarded, and as we ascended a broad carpeted staircase, the very air seemed heavy with the scent of old leather, cigar smoke, and unshakable tradition. A clerk with a hushed voice showed us into a room dominated by a vast mahogany desk and a man who seemed hewn from the same timber. Lord Harrington Cole was a man of considerable bulk, with a florid face and eyes the colour of a stormy sea. He did not rise, but watched our approach from his throne-like leather chair, the rhythmic ticking of a grand clock on the mantelpiece, the only sound in the room. He gestured to a pair of chairs with a flick of his wrist, a gesture that was less an invitation and more a command. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, accustomed to filling chambers far larger than this. "Mr. Holmes, I was told to expect you. To what do I owe this intrusion? I trust it concerns a matter of actual importance," replied Lord Harrington Cole. My friend's reply was cool and precise, a surgeon's scalpel against the Lord's bludgeon. "It concerns the attempted murder of Miss Eleanor Vance, a matter I should think of some importance, even to her most vocal opponents," Sherlock Holmes responded. The Lord's ruddy complexion deepened to a dangerous purple. He slammed a heavy fist upon his desk, making a stack of papers jump. The sudden sharp sound echoed in the quiet office. "Attempted murder? Good heavens, man, that is preposterous! The woman is a public nuisance, a shrieking hysteric bent on dismantling the natural order of society. I have said as much on the floor of the House. I make no secret of my contempt for her and her rabble. But to suggest I would stoop to poison, that is an outrageous slander," said Lord Harrington Cole. "Your lordship makes his position admirably clear," Holmes stated, his tone betraying no emotion. "And yet you will concede that such profound animosity provides a compelling motive," Sherlock Holmes said. He gave a short, barking laugh that was entirely without humour. "Motive? Every sane man in England has a motive to silence that woman. But if I were to deal with such a creature, I assure you it would not be with some skulking, cowardly powder. It is not my way," Lord Harrington Cole answered. The interview continued in this fashion for another quarter of an hour, a storm of blustering denial from the Lord, met with quiet, probing questions from my friend. Holmes, having exhausted his line of inquiry, rose at last, and I with him. The heavy oak door clipped shut behind us, and we were once more in the hushed corridor, the Lord's booming voice now a muffled thunder. As we descended the stairs and emerged into the damp air of the street, I felt a certainty solidifying within me. There can be little doubt, Holmes. The man despises her. He has the motive, the influence, and a temper hot enough to boil the Thames. We have found our culprit, Dr. John Watson added. Holmes did not reply at once. He stood on the pavement, his gaze fixed on the grey sky as the sounds of hooves and carriage wheels clattered around us. Then he turned to me, a peculiar glint in his eye. "On the contrary, Watson, we have found a man who is precisely what he appears to be, a loud, arrogant, and utterly unsubtle creature. He is a lion in his den, all roar and fury. He would attack head-on with a public denouncement or a lawsuit. He would not hunt with a poisoned dart," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. My confusion must have been plain on my face, for he offered a thin smile at my bewilderment and elaborated as he flagged down a passing cab. "The crime was elegant, Watson. It was subtle, scientific, and designed to mimic nature itself. It speaks not of a raging bull, but of a quiet, meticulous serpent. No, the mind behind this attack is one of patience and specialized knowledge, qualities which Lord Harrington Cole possesses in as little quantity as he does humility. He climbed into the cab, his entire demeanor having shifted. The frustration of the interview had vanished, replaced by the familiar energy of a new and more promising line of inquiry. He reached into his coat and produced the small envelope containing the sample from Miss Vance's shawl. To Baker Street, driver. The world of politics has yielded nothing but noise. It is time we consulted a more truthful witness. The silent, reddish-brown dust in this envelope. Our return to Baker Street was a quiet affair, the damp chill of the November evening having seeped into our very bones. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of a hansom's hooves on the wet cobblestones faded into the general murmur of the city. I confess my own spirits were low, for our interview with Lord Harrington Cole had produced nothing but bluster and aristocratic indignation. The case felt as impenetrable as the fog that now pressed against our window panes. A dead end, Holmes, I fear. The man is a boor and a bully, but he has not the wit for such a devilish scheme, responded Dr. John Watson. Holmes did not reply at once. He had already shed his coat, moving with that peculiar silent intensity that signified the hunt was truly afoot. From a locked cabinet he produced his powerful brass microscope, its lenses gleaming in the gaslight. He placed it upon the central table with a soft, decisive thud, commanding the room's entire attention. From his waistcoat pocket he carefully retrieved the small envelope containing the reddish-brown dust we had collected. With the delicate precision of a surgeon, he prepared a slide, his long, thin fingers working deftly. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the soft hiss of the gas mantle and the steady tick-tock of the clock upon the mantelpiece. He bent over the eyepiece, his back a sharp curve of concentration, one hand adjusting the focus with minute turns of the brass wheel. I settled into my armchair by the fire, the crackle of the coals a comforting sound against the tense silence, resigning myself to a long vigil. "Ah, Sherlock Holmes," responded. The exclamation was so sharp I nearly started from my chair. Holmes did not move from the instrument, but I could sense a new and vibrant energy in his posture. He gestured with one impatient finger. "Watson, come here. Your medical eye may be of some service. Tell me what you see." I rose and crossed the room, the floorboards groaning faintly under my weight. I peered into the eyepiece as he directed, and saw a field of tiny, granular, reddish-brown particles, much as they had appeared to the naked eye. "It appears to be a fine dust, Holmes, perhaps of brick or some mineral compound." "Much as I expected," wondered Dr. John Watson. "Expected? My dear Watson, you see, but you do not observe. Look again. Do you see the uniform crystalline structure of a mineral, or do you see shape, form, an organic architecture?" stated Sherlock Holmes. His voice was low and intense. I pressed my eye to the lens once more, adjusting my focus. This time I perceived what he meant. The particles were not jagged fragments. Many possessed a distinct, almost geometric symmetry. Some were ovoid, others triangular, all bearing intricate patterns upon their surfaces. They were not shattered remnants of a larger whole, but complete forms unto themselves. Good heavens, Holmes, they are not mineral at all. They are biological. remarked Dr. John Watson. "Precisely. This is no common dust swept from a mantelpiece. It is not a poison from the chemist's shelf that Lestrade so eagerly seeks. We are dealing with something far more subtle. This, my dear fellow, is pollen," Sherlock Holmes noted. The legs of his chair scraped harshly against the floorboards as he shot to his feet, his grey eyes alight with the fire of discovery. He began to pace before the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, the game once more renewed. "A most singular and potent variety, if I am not mistaken. The entire premise of the investigation has shifted. We are no longer in the realm of the apothecary, but of the botanist. Our quarry is not a common brute like Harrington Cole, but someone with specialized knowledge," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He stopped his pacing and turned to me, a thin, triumphant smile playing upon his lips. The fog outside was of no consequence now. A brilliant light of understanding had dawned within our rooms. "There is only one place in London where such esoteric knowledge is concentrated. Watson, lay out my travelling coat. In the morning we shall pay a visit to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew," replied Sherlock Holmes. The following morning found us rattling along in a hansom cab, leaving the grey labyrinth of London behind for the verdant promise of Kew. The oppressive weight of the city, with its ceaseless rumble of iron-shod wheels and its scent of coal smoke, seemed to lift from my spirits with every mile. Holmes, however, was impervious to the change of scenery. He sat opposite me, a small glass slide held delicately between his thumb and forefinger, his gaze fixed upon the almost invisible dusting of golden powder it contained. "Poisons are a clumsy business, Watson. Arsenic, strychnine, they are the bludgeons of the criminal world. They leave a trail a Scotland Yard man could follow blindfolded. But this is different. This is the stiletto, silent and precise, drawn from nature's own cabinet," stated Sherlock Holmes. His voice was low and intense, filled with the peculiar relish he reserved for the intellectual intricacies of a case. We soon arrived, and the crunch of our boots on the fine gravel path was the only sound to break the morning's tranquillity. We were directed to the herbarium, a quiet, studious building that smelled of old paper and pressed flowers. There we were met by a Mr. Henry Armitage, the head botanist, a tall, stooping man with earth under his fingernails and eyes that seemed accustomed to peering at the minute. "Mr. Armitage, I presume? My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We have come to solicit your expert opinion on a botanical matter of some urgency," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Armitage gave a short, dry nod. He led us into a workroom lined with mahogany cabinets and cluttered with microscopes and scientific apparatus. The air within was warm and still. Holmes produced the slide without further preamble. The botanist took it, his movements practised and economical, and placed it upon the stage of a large brass microscope. For a long moment the only sound was the soft click of the focusing wheel as he made his adjustments. "Fascinating, quite fascinating. The structure is familiar, yet exotic. This is the pollen of a rhododendron, of that there is no doubt. But it is certainly not a species native to these isles," Henry Armitage said. He straightened up, his brow furrowed in concentration. He gestured towards a massive, leather-bound book on a nearby table, its pages filled with intricate, hand-coloured illustrations. "Yes, here we are. It is as I suspected. This is from Rhododendron ponticum, subspecies beticum, the Himalayan variant, a beautiful but treacherous plant. Its nectar, and indeed its pollen, in sufficient concentration, contains a potent neurotoxin," responded Henry Armitage. "A poison? Good heavens, man!" wondered Dr. John Watson. "Indeed, Doctor. It induces vertigo, paralysis, a severe constriction of the lungs, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for a sudden, violent illness of natural origin. An ancient poison, in fact, once used to defeat Xenophon's army," Henry Armitage said. A thin, triumphant smile played upon Holmes's lips. He had found his stiletto. "And tell me, Mr. Armitage, how many individuals in all of England possess the skill and means to cultivate such a dangerous bloom?" stated Sherlock Holmes. The botanist pushed his spectacles up his nose, his expression thoughtful. "Very few, sir. It is notoriously difficult to cultivate in our climate. Beyond our own collection here at Kew, I should be surprised if there were more than a half-dozen private collectors in the country who possess a mature specimen," Henry Armitage said. Holmes's grey eyes shone with a cold, hard light. The vast, anonymous expanse of London had suddenly shrunk to a handful of names on a list. The hunt was no longer a search, but a pursuit. "Then our next task is a simple one, Watson. We must procure the names of these horticulturalists, every last one," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. We had returned to Baker Street under a sky the colour of slate. A persistent autumn drizzle wept against the window panes, and the hiss and pop of the fire in our grate was a welcome reply to the gloom. I confess my own spirits were somewhat dampened, but Holmes, on the other hand, was alight with a fierce, nervous energy. He paced the length of our sitting-room, a wiry silhouette against the gaslight, while our companion from the Home Office, Mr. Henry Armitage, sat stiffly in an armchair, watching him with a mixture of apprehension and awe. We were all waiting. The sharp clang of the street-level bell cut through the quiet hum of the city. A few moments later, Mrs. Hudson's boy appeared with a long, sealed envelope, which he presented to my friend. The rustle of the thick paper was the only sound in the room as Holmes broke the wax seal and drew forth a single, heavily inked sheet. He spread it upon the table beneath the lamp, his long, thin finger tracing the lines of script. His voice was tight with suspense. "Is he there, Mr. Holmes? Is Lord Harrington Cole's name on the list?" Henry Armitage replied. A flicker of a smile played upon Holmes's lips, though his eyes remained fixed upon the page. He did not answer immediately, letting the silence stretch until Armitage shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Patience, my dear sir," he said at last, his tone crisp and didactic. "The most vital clue is often not what is present, but what is absent. And I can confirm that Lord Harrington Cole, our supposed fiend of Parliament, is entirely absent from this registry. He is a man of loud opinions and public debate, not of quiet horticulture and subtle poisons. It was never his game," Sherlock Holmes responded. With that single statement, the entire official theory of the case, upon which Scotland Yard had expended so much energy, collapsed into nothing. Armitage let out a slow breath, his expression one of profound confusion. "It seems, then, the police have been pursuing a ghost," I observed. Dr. John Watson said. "They have been pursuing the obvious," he corrected, tapping the paper with a triumphant finality. "And the obvious is the greatest enemy of the truth. No, our culprit is not a man who stands in the public eye. He is a specialist, a man who moves in a world of his own making. A man like this one," deduced Sherlock Holmes. His finger came to rest halfway down the second column of names. Armitage and I leaned forward together, our heads nearly touching as we peered at the entry he indicated. It was a simple name, without title or adornment. Mr. Silas Abernathy, of the Briars, Kent. The annotation from our contact at Kew describes him as a gentleman of considerable private means and a noted recluse. He corresponds with botanical societies, but has not set foot in London for over a decade. He lives, it would seem, for his collection alone. Armitage sounded baffled. But what possible motive could a secluded botanist have to attack Miss Vance? Their worlds could not be further apart, Henry Armitage said. The most potent grievances are those that are allowed to fester in isolation, Armitage. A forgotten slight, a professional jealousy, a social philosophy curdled by solitude. Such things can grow in the quiet dark into monstrous forms, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. I watched my friend, his face illuminated by the lamp, and saw not a detective, but a philosopher of the human soul. He spoke of hatred as a botanist might speak of a rare and deadly orchid, something to be cultivated with patience and precision. A man who dedicates his life to the careful cultivation of a poison may, when the right provocation arises, find himself uniquely equipped to act upon that hatred, replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes rose from the table, his movements suddenly decisive. The languor of the waiting man was gone, replaced by the sharp energy of the hunter who has found the scent. The air in the room seemed to crackle around him. Our work in London is concluded for the present. We shall take the first train to Kent in the morning. Pack what you need for a day in the country, gentlemen, he announced, his voice low, but charged with an unmistakable current of anticipation. We are going to pay a visit to Mr. Abernathy's silent garden. The journey into the heart of Kent was a welcome respite from the London fog. The rhythmic clatter of the train gave way to the gentle trot of a hired trap, its wheels crunching over the gravel of a long and winding drive. We were bound for the estate of Mr. Abernathy, the reclusive botanist whose name had stood out so starkly upon Holmes's list. The air here was clean and sharp, scented with damp earth and the promise of autumn. Yet the estate itself possessed a certain sterile quality. Every hedge was clipped to within an inch of its life, and the lawns were unnaturally perfect, giving the impression of a place maintained by rules rather than by passion. Mr. Abernathy himself met us at the door, a tall, desiccated man with hands like tangled roots, and eyes that seemed to resent the intrusion of sunlight. He listened to Holmes's brief, carefully worded explanation with an air of impatient disinterest. His voice was dry, like rustling leaves. The constabulary has already been in contact. A political matter, I am told, utterly tedious. My plants have no interest in Parliament. You may see the grounds, but I must insist you do not disturb anything. I have delicate work under way," answered Mr. Abernathy. He gestured vaguely towards the gardens before retreating back into the gloom of his house, the heavy oak door closing with a soft but definitive thud. We were left standing alone on the stone steps. Holmes gave me a slight, almost perceptible smile. A man who prefers the company of Flora to that of his fellow man. Let us see what secrets his silent companions might tell, Sherlock Holmes said. Our path led us inevitably to a great glass house shimmering in the afternoon sun. The air within was thick and humid, a stark contrast to the crisp day outside. It was a veritable jungle of exotic specimens, their vibrant colours a riot against the green. And there, in a place of honour upon a central bench, was the very plant we had come to see, the Himalayan rhododendron, its large leathery leaves seeming to absorb the very light from the air. Holmes circled it slowly, his eyes missing nothing, from the composition of the soil in its pot to the careful pruning of its branches. He touched nothing, yet I knew he was committing every detail to his formidable memory. As we emerged, blinking, back into the bright afternoon, we came upon a man tending a bed of roses, his back to us. He started violently as Holmes cleared his throat, dropping his trowel with a metallic clatter against the stone pathway. "A fine collection," he remarked, his tone mild and conversational. Sherlock Holmes noted. The gardener, a man with nervous, shifting eyes and earth deeply ingrained beneath his fingernails, wiped his hands on his trousers. He seemed almost unnaturally eager to speak. "Aye, sir. Mr. Abernathy, he's very particular, especially about what's in the glass house. Top-notch security he has, a special lock and all." He paused, then added with an air of manufactured helpfulness, "Funny thing, though. Found something near this very path only last week. Thought it might be important, what with all the talk," answered the gardener. He fumbled in his waistcoat pocket, producing a small, folded square of fine linen. As he opened it, my breath caught. Embroidered in neat, dark blue thread in the corner were the initials H.C., a direct and damning link to Lord Harrington Cole. "Good heavens, Holmes, this is it," wondered Dr. John Watson. Holmes simply took the handkerchief, his expression unreadable. He examined the monogram for a moment, then folded it carefully and placed it into his own pocket. "Thank you," he said to the gardener, his voice betraying no excitement. "You have been most helpful," Sherlock Holmes said. On the carriage ride back to the station, the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves filled a long silence. I was bursting with the implications of our discovery, but Holmes sat opposite me, his chin sunk upon his chest and his brow furrowed in the deepest thought. The silence stretched until I could bear it no more. "The case is all but closed, surely. A man with a clear motive, now placed directly at the scene of the crime. Harrington Cole is our man," Dr. John Watson added. Holmes lifted his head, his grey eyes sharp and intense. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and precise, cutting through my premature conclusions. "On the contrary, Watson, it is far too neat. A man of Lord Harrington Cole's standing, engaged in a clandestine act, would scarcely be so careless as to drop his monogrammed handkerchief like a calling card."
And our gardener, did you not note his rehearsed speech, his eagerness to present this perfect piece of evidence? No, this is not a clue. It is a fabrication, a signpost deliberately erected to point us down the wrong road, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. I stared at him, my triumphant certainty draining away, replaced by a dawning understanding of the deeper game at play. The handkerchief was not the key. It was the lock on a different door entirely. Our reclusive botanist wishes us to pursue a political motive. That alone tells me the true motive is not political at all, but intensely personal. We are no longer investigating an enemy of the suffrage movement, Watson. We are hunting a man nursing a long and bitter revenge, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Upon our return to Baker Street, the yellow London fog had once more descended, pressing its grimy fingers against our window panes. Holmes had sunk into his favourite armchair, the monogrammed handkerchief from the gardener resting upon the small table beside him. He stared into the fire, his long, thin fingers steepled, the very picture of intense concentration. Mr. Armitage of the Home Office paced before the hearth, his footsteps a restless rhythmic beat upon the worn rug. It is damning, Holmes, you must admit. Harrington Cole's own initials. It places him squarely at the scene, answered Henry Armitage. Holmes shifted his gaze from the flames, and a thin, ironic smile touched his lips. It places him precisely where our reclusive botanist wishes us to find him. It is a signpost, Armitage, not a clue. Lord Harrington Cole is a man of considerable ego and political cunning, but he is no fool. To drop one's own monogrammed linen at the scene of a crime is an act of such theatrical stupidity that it belongs upon the stage at Drury Lane, not in a serious criminal enterprise, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He picked up the handkerchief, letting it fall from his fingers as if it were a distasteful object. No, this is a distraction. The method of the attack was subtle, intellectual. The motive, therefore, must be sought on the same plane. This is not about politics. The roots of this affair run deeper into the dark soil of personal injury. We have been looking at the wrong history. Sherlock Holmes responded. "What do you propose?" replied Henry Armitage. "I propose, my dear fellow, an evening of literary pursuit. You have influence. I require access tonight to the archives of the London Telegraph. We are not searching for a recent crime, but for an old wound. We must find the moment that Abernathy's path first crossed that of Miss Eleanor Vance," observed Sherlock Holmes. And so it was that shortly before midnight the three of us found ourselves in the cavernous, chilled repository of that great newspaper. The air was thick with the dry, dusty scent of decaying paper and old ink. Gas lamps cast long dancing shadows down aisles of towering shelves, each one groaning under the weight of immense leather-bound volumes. A profound silence enveloped us, broken only by the whisper of our own movements and the faint, dry rustle of the pages we turned. For hours we laboured, our fingers blackened with print. Holmes directed our search with quiet intensity, assigning each of us a span of years to meticulously peruse. The task seemed Herculean, the sheer volume of newsprint overwhelming. Just as my own hopes began to flag, a sudden sharp intake of breath came from Armitage. "My God! Holmes, listen to this!" responded Henry Armitage. His voice, though low, echoed in the vast, silent room. He held a volume open, his finger tracing a column from some 5 years prior. He began to read in a steady, deliberate tone.
At the annual debate of the Ladies' Society for Civic Improvement, a spirited exchange took place between Mrs. Alistair Abernathy, a noted opponent of the suffrage cause, and the firebrand campaigner, Miss Eleanor Vance. Mrs. Abernathy spoke with passion on the sanctity of the domestic sphere, only to be met with a retort from Miss Vance of such surgical precision and withering wit that it left the elder gentlewoman quite speechless. The subsequent laughter from the gallery sealed what can only be described as a complete and utter public humiliation. Armitage looked up from the page, his face illuminated by the gaslight. It goes on to say that Mrs. Abernathy, a prominent social figure, withdrew entirely from public life thereafter and passed away within the year, answered Henry Armitage. A profound silence descended once more. Holmes stepped forward and took the heavy volume from Armitage's hands, his grey eyes blazing with a fierce, cold light. The distant chime of a city clock striking 2 floated through the dusty air. There is our thread of vengeance. Not a political assassination, but a husband's retribution for the social ruin and, in his mind, the death of his wife. He has cultivated this revenge for 5 years, nurturing it with the same patience he affords his rarest blooms, observed Sherlock Holmes. He closed the book with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to finalize the matter entirely. He looked from me to Armitage, his expression now thoughtful, almost distant. Before we draw the net, I find I have a need to see Miss Vance once more. I must understand the woman who could inspire such a terrible, logical devotion, stated Sherlock Holmes. The revelation from the archives hung heavy in the air. The grey morning light found little purchase in the London streets, and the clatter of our hansom cab on the wet cobblestones beat a sombre drum. We were no longer hunting a mere political fanatic, but a ghost animated by a deep and personal vengeance. The sick room we had first visited was gone, replaced now by a study lined with books and pamphlets. The air, far from still, vibrated with a restless energy. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, its light dancing across piles of correspondence on a grand oak desk. "You have returned, Mr. Holmes. I confess I am surprised. I had assumed your interest in my case would have waned by now," Miss Eleanor Vance said. She stood by the window, no longer a frail victim, but a figure of considerable presence, her voice steady and clear despite its lack of full strength. Holmes removed his hat and gloves, placing them with methodical care upon a small side table. "On the contrary, Miss Vance, my interest has only sharpened. I have come to understand the motive, but I find I do not yet fully comprehend the cause," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. A flicker of suspicion crossed her features. She gestured for us to sit, though she herself remained standing, a commander upon her own quarter-deck. "The cause? It is the right of half the population of this nation to have a voice in its governance. It seems a simple enough proposition," replied Miss Eleanor Vance. "Simplicity is often the most difficult thing to achieve. Lord Harrington Cole, for instance, believes your efforts will unravel the very fabric of society. He speaks of tradition, of natural order.
His argument, though I may find it flawed, possesses its own internal logic. Tell me yours, explained Sherlock Holmes.
For a moment I thought she might refuse. Instead, a new light entered her eyes. She stepped forward, hands clasped behind her, and began to speak. This was not the fiery rhetoric of a public rally, but a discourse of cool, irrefutable reason. She detailed laws that treated women as property, the denial of education, the gross injustice of taxation without representation. Her measured voice and the steady tick of a heavy mantel clock were the only sounds in the room.
We are told that a woman's mind is not suited to the rigors of political thought. Yet that same mind is expected to manage a household, raise the next generation of citizens, and navigate a world whose laws are crafted entirely without her consent. It is not a question of sentiment, Mr. Holmes. It is a failure of logic. An equation where one side is arbitrarily declared to be of lesser value. There can be no stable society built upon such a faulty premise. It is an intellectual absurdity, replied Miss Eleanor Vance.
She fell silent. I found myself stirred and glanced at Holmes. He leaned forward, chin on his steepled fingers, his gaze fixed upon her with an intensity I had seldom witnessed. His eyes held no mockery, no clinical detachment, only what looked remarkably like genuine intellectual respect. Beside me, Armitage shifted, a silent acknowledgment of the moment. "You frame your position not as a plea, but as a proof," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His voice was quiet, almost a murmur.
"Because it is one. Justice is merely logic applied to human affairs," remarked Miss Eleanor Vance. Holmes held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stood up abruptly, the thoughtful mood broken as if by a sudden switch. His eyes, once more the sharp, piercing instruments of the detective, signalled that the time for philosophy had passed.
"There is, as you say, an undeniable logic to your position, and it is with logic that we shall expose your attacker. For that purpose, Miss Vance, I must ask for your presence at my rooms, 221B Baker Street, tomorrow evening at 9 o'clock precisely. Do not fail me. The final act of this curious drama is about to be played," replied Sherlock Holmes. Her eyes widened, but she gave a firm nod of assent. As we took our leave and stepped back out into the damp chill of the London afternoon, I knew that Holmes was not merely setting a trap for a culprit. He was arranging a board upon which all the players, the politician, the victim, and the vengeful ghost would finally be forced to show their hand.
The atmosphere in our sitting-room at 221B Baker Street was of a thickness that a knife might fail to penetrate, heavy with the scent of damp wool and the city's coal smoke. The November fog pressed against the window panes like a ghostly hand, its damp tendrils muffling the familiar clatter of hansoms on the street below, reducing the city's roar to a distant, mournful sigh. Within, the silence was broken only by the soft hiss and crackle of the fire, a valiant but losing battle against the chill that seeped from the very walls, throwing dancing shadows upon a most incongruous assembly. Miss Eleanor Vance sat ramrod straight in her chair, her face a pale, determined mask. Opposite her, Lord Harrington Cole fidgeted, his florid complexion a testament to his mounting indignation.
And in a corner, almost fading into the gloom, sat the quiet botanist, Mr. Abernathy, his gaze fixed upon the carpet. Holmes stood before the hearth, his expression unreadable, the very picture of a showman awaiting his cue.
"I must protest this imposition, Mr. Holmes. To be summoned here like a common tradesman, it is an outrage, an absolute outrage," said Lord Harrington Cole. "My sentiments precisely, my lord, though for different reasons. I have a movement to lead, not time for drawing-room theatricals." "What is the meaning of this charade?" remarked Miss Eleanor Vance. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I confess I am quite at a loss. My work at the gardens awaits," Mr. Abernathy answered.
"Patience, I beg you. All will be made clear. In a case of this complexity, it is essential to have all the principals upon the stage before the curtain may rise on the final act," Sherlock Holmes said. As he spoke, a heavy, purposeful tread sounded upon our staircase, each step punctuated by the groan of an old floorboard. The sound was unmistakable. The brass doorknob rattled violently before the door swung open without the courtesy of a knock, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood framed in the doorway, 2 burly constables behind him. "Ah, Holmes, good. You've saved us the trouble of a trip to Whitehall," answered Inspector Lestrade. His ferret-like eyes ignored the rest of us and fixed upon Lord Harrington Cole, the parliamentarian, with an air of grim triumph. He took a step into the room, bringing with him a gust of cold, damp air from the hallway, his voice booming with official satisfaction. "Lord Harrington Cole, it is my duty to inform you that you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Miss Eleanor Vance." The Lord sputtered, his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards as he half rose, his face turning a shade of purple I had previously thought only possible in a painter's palette. Miss Vance let out a short, sharp gasp of surprise, her animosity for the man momentarily forgotten in the face of the sheer drama. Before Lestrade could advance another foot, Holmes raised a single slender hand, a gesture of quiet command that instantly stilled the room. "One moment, Inspector. You are, as is so often the case, proceeding with admirable energy upon an entirely erroneous assumption," Sherlock Holmes noted. "Erroneous? Holmes, the man's motive is as plain as the nose on your face. He despised her and everything she stands for," responded Inspector Lestrade. "Indeed, and it is that very obviousness which has blinded you. The crime is not one of politics, but of passion, not of public debate, but of private revenge," stated Sherlock Holmes. A profound hush fell over the room once more, so deep that the sudden shift and collapse of a log in the grate sounded like a pistol shot. Holmes turned his back on the stunned inspector and faced the rest of his audience. His eyes, glittering in the firelight, seemed to pierce the very soul of each person present as he prepared to deliver his final, astonishing pronouncement. The air in our sitting-room at 221B Baker Street was thick with unspoken accusations. A profound silence reigned, broken only by the soft hiss of coals in the hearth and the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. Inspector Lestrade, his bulldog features a grim mask of certainty, fixed his gaze upon Lord Harrington Cole, who returned the look with sputtering indignation. Miss Vance sat rigid, her face pale but her eyes missing nothing, whilst the botanist, Mr. Abernathy, had retreated into the shadows near the window, a man forgotten.
"It is a common failing, Inspector, to mistake the obvious for the true," observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's calm, incisive voice pierced the tension. He turned from the fire, where he had been standing with his back to us, his hawk-like features catching the gaslight. Obvious? The man threatened her in Parliament. He had motive and opportunity. It's as plain a case as I've ever seen, Inspector Lestrade said.
"This is an outrage, an absolute scandal, to be dragged here like a common criminal," remarked Lord Harrington Cole. "Pray be silent, my lord. Your innocence is as plain to me as your political opinions. You are a man of the public stage. Your weapons are speeches and editorials, not subtle poisons. You are a sledgehammer, sir, and this crime was committed with a surgeon's scalpel. It required a finesse entirely beyond your temperament," stated Sherlock Holmes. Lord Harrington Cole gaped, unsure whether he had been acquitted or insulted. Holmes, however, had already dismissed him, his focus shifting to the centre of the room. From his waistcoat pocket he produced a small glass slide, holding it up to the light. The weapon, gentlemen, and Miss Vance, was not a chemical concoction known to Scotland Yard. It was not a poison to be found in any European apothecary. It was this, declared Sherlock Holmes. Upon the glass I discerned a faint dusting of reddish-brown powder. It looked utterly innocuous, like brick dust, or perhaps common snuff. "Pollen? You cannot be serious, Mr. Holmes. That is what has laid me low for weeks," answered Miss Eleanor Vance. Disbelief threaded through her voice, yet she leaned forward, her fatigue momentarily forgotten. "Not just any pollen, Miss Vance. This is from the rhododendron arboreum, a species that grows only in a very specific altitude of the Himalayan mountains. In its concentrated form, its nectar produces what ancient travellers called mad honey. But the pollen itself, when inhaled by a susceptible individual, mimics a catastrophic ailment of the nerves. It causes collapse, fever, and delirium, yet leaves no trace a common physician would recognize as poison. It is a weapon of exquisite rarity," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. "A soft scrape of a shoe on the floorboards drew my attention. By the window, Mr. Abernathy had gone terribly still." Holmes's explanation resonated in the air, a masterpiece of cold, clear logic that accounted for the strange symptoms, the lack of evidence, and the sheer audacity of the attack. The Himalayas? But who in London would have such a thing? Inspector Lestrade answered. Holmes did not answer Lestrade. Instead, his piercing grey eyes moved slowly from the glass slide and settled with dreadful finality upon the quiet botanist. "Who indeed, Inspector? Who but a man whose entire life is dedicated to the study and acquisition of the world's rarest flora? A man who supplied the very bouquet from which Miss Vance inhaled her illness? A man whose career was inadvertently ruined years ago by Miss Vance's father, a fact I uncovered only this morning. Is that not so, Mr. Abernathy?" Sherlock Holmes said. The silence that fell upon our chambers at 221B Baker Street was of a quality I had seldom experienced. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a brittle, stretched thing, threatening to shatter at the slightest sound. The air, thick with the scent of shag tobacco and old paper, seemed to vibrate with Holmes's final damning words. Mr. Abernathy, who moments before had been a picture of academic confidence, now stood white-lipped and trembling by the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed upon my friend as if mesmerized by a serpent. "This is utter madness, a baseless fantasy woven from whole cloth," replied Mr. Abernathy. His voice, however, was thin and reedy, utterly devoid of conviction. Inspector Lestrade, standing near the door with his bowler hat clutched in his hands, shifted his considerable weight from one foot to the other, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. "Is it madness to know that your monograph on Himalayan flora was publicly discredited by Miss Vance's father a decade ago, effectively ending your academic prospects? Or is it fantasy to suggest that your subsequent expedition, funded by a private inheritance, gave you exclusive access to the rhododendron anthropogon, the very source of this debilitating pollen?" Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes spoke without raising his voice, yet each word landed with the precise impact of a surgeon's scalpel. He gestured towards a small glass slide on the table, upon which a few reddish-brown specks were visible beneath a lens. "You cultivated it in secret. You waited for the perfect moment, when Miss Vance's collapse would cause the greatest possible public spectacle. You are not a murderer, Mr. Abernathy. Your ambition was something far more insidious," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Abernathy seemed to deflate. His shoulders slumped, and a long shuddering sigh escaped his lips, a sound of utter defeat. He sank into the nearest armchair, his head in his hands. The crackle of the fire in the grate was the only sound for a long moment. "He ruined me," her father. "He called my life's work a fraud, and she carried on his legacy, championing every cause he held dear. Her name celebrated, while mine was forgotten, relegated to footnotes and mockery," remarked Mr. Abernathy. He looked up, his eyes burning with a feverish resentment that was terrible to behold. "Death would have made her a martyr. I did not want to grant her that dignity. I wanted to discredit her, to see her fall not from a poisoner's hand, but from a fit of apparent hysteria, a sudden, inexplicable collapse before her adoring crowd. The papers would have called her frail, overwrought, emotionally unfit for the very rights she demanded. It would have destroyed her credibility, and with it the foundation of her cause. It was to be a botanist's revenge, subtle, poetic, and absolute." He spoke the confession in a low, bitter monotone that was more chilling than any shout. The sheer depth of the man's vindictiveness left me speechless. Inspector Lestrade, however, had heard enough. He stepped forward, his boots making a heavy, decisive sound on the floorboards. He placed a firm hand on the botanist's shoulder. "Henry Abernathy, I am taking you into custody for the attempted infliction of grievous harm upon Miss Eleanor Vance. You would do well to say nothing more," answered Inspector Lestrade. Abernathy offered no resistance. He rose like a man in a dream, his face a blank mask of despair. We listened as Lestrade's heavy tread, accompanied by the botanist's lighter, shuffling step, descended the 17 stairs to the street below. A moment later, the sharp slam of our front door echoed up, final and irrevocable. Holmes stood by the window, peering down into the foggy street as the cab rattled away, carrying the author of so much misery into the arms of justice. An attack not on the body, Watson, but on the mind and the message. A crime for a new and altogether more complicated age, replied Sherlock Holmes. After Lestrade departed with his prisoner, a heavy silence fell upon our rooms at 221B Baker Street. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a street vendor. The tension of the investigation had broken, leaving an awkward resolution in its wake. Lord Harrington Cole, who had stood rigidly by the mantelpiece, cleared his throat with a dry, rasping sound. "Mr. Holmes, it appears I am in your debt, and I owe this lady an apology," said Lord Harrington Cole. He spoke the words with great difficulty, his proud posture slumping slightly. Miss Vance, who had been seated, regarded him not with triumph, but with a cool, appraising gaze. "Your opposition to my cause is a matter of public record, my lord. I have never taken it personally. This affair, however, was a different matter entirely. Your apology is accepted," Miss Eleanor Vance answered. Miss Eleanor Vance answered. She then turned her attention to my friend, who had been observing the exchange with a detached, almost clinical interest. A flicker of genuine warmth entered her expression. "And to you, Mr. Holmes, I offer more than an apology for my earlier suspicions. I offer my profound gratitude. You saw a puzzle where Scotland Yard saw only political motive. I confess your methods are as unconventional as the crime itself." Miss Eleanor Vance replied. "The motive was merely the frame for the picture, Miss Vance. The picture itself was a composition of botanical detail. The culprit's error was in believing that a crime without a common poison was a crime without a trace. He forgot that nature herself keeps the most meticulous of ledgers. The unique crystalline structure of the pollen, visible only under my microscope, was as definitive as a signature on a confession," Sherlock Holmes said. He gestured vaguely towards his work-table, where the brass instrument still stood. Henry Armitage, who had remained a quiet observer throughout, nodded in sober agreement. "A masterful piece of work, Holmes, truly masterful," said Henry Armitage. Miss Vance rose from her chair, her slight frame seeming to gain stature. Her expression was no longer one of indignation, but of renewed purpose. "The great irony, gentlemen, is that Mr. Abernathy's contemptible act has produced the very opposite of its intended effect. He wished to see me discredited, to have my collapse be seen as female hysteria, a proof against my cause. Miss Eleanor Vance said—" Her voice, which had trembled slightly when she first arrived, now rang with the clear, resonant timbre of the practised orator, filling the small room with undeniable power. "Instead, he has given me a platform I could never have achieved on my own. He sought to silence one voice, but his failure will give strength to thousands. My resolve, and that of my sisters in the movement, has never been more absolute. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a speech to redraft." With a final, decisive nod to Holmes, she and a humbled Lord Harrington Cole took their leave. The heavy front door kicked shut, its sound echoing up the stairwell. The quiet returned, deeper this time. Holmes moved to the window, peering down into the gas-lit street.
"A formidable woman, Watson, quite formidable," explained Sherlock Holmes.
He turned from the window, his gaze sweeping over Armitage and then myself. Picking up his pipe from the mantelpiece, he sank into his armchair, a thoughtful expression settling upon his sharp features in the firelight. And a most singular case. The motive was as old as time, a petty man's wounded pride. Yet the method speaks to the changing face of our very world. The final embers of the case had died down, leaving us in the comfortable quiet of our Baker Street rooms. Outside, a persistent November drizzle slicked the cobblestones, and the rattle of a late hansom cab was a lonely, fleeting sound against the city's murmur. A fire danced in the hearth, its cheerful crackle a welcome counterpoint to the gloom beyond our windows. My friend Sherlock Holmes sat opposite our guest, the eminent botanist Henry Armitage, the two of them wreathed in the blue haze of their respective pipes. It is still quite the most singular application of my field I have ever encountered. To turn the very essence of a plant's life into a weapon of such precision, it is both monstrous and, I must confess, brilliant, responded Henry Armitage. Armitage spoke in the calm, measured tones of a man more accustomed to lecture halls than criminal conspiracies, his words carrying the weight of academic curiosity. The method was indeed elegant in its simplicity. The motive, however, proved to be a far more tangled root, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes leaned back, steepling his long fingers. For hours he had been in this reflective mood, the manic elegy of the chase having given way to a deep and unusual contemplation. I recalled Miss Vance's final declaration, her spirit not broken, but forged anew by the ordeal, and it was clear the sentiment had not been lost on my companion. I am accustomed, Armitage, to the familiar patterns of human wickedness. Greed, jealousy, revenge, they are the primary colours on a criminal's palette. This affair, however, was painted in shades I had not previously considered. It was a crime born not merely of personal animosity, but of a profound societal schism. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He gestured with the stem of his pipe towards the fire, as if the shifting flames mirrored the very image of the conflict. I confess I underestimated the sheer force of the political passions at play. The attempt to silence Miss Vance was crude, but the ideology behind it is a complex and powerful current. To navigate it, one requires more than a magnifying glass. One needs a new kind of chart altogether, observed Sherlock Holmes. It was a remarkable admission from a man who held pure, cold reason above all else. He fell silent for a moment, and the quiet was filled only by the hiss of the gaslight and the soft settling of coals in the grate. And the lady herself, Miss Vance. A formidable woman, said Henry Armitage. A slow smile touched Holmes's thin lips, a rare expression of unambiguous respect. Formidable is the precise word. Her conviction is a thing of clinical purity. To face public ridicule, political opposition, and a direct attempt upon her life, only to declare that her resolve has been strengthened, that is not mere stubbornness. It is the mark of a general, a strategist of the highest order. Her campaign is her battlefield, and she commands it with a logic that is, in its own way, as rigorous as my own. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He rose from his chair and stood before the mantelpiece,
his tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the firelight. The case was closed and the culprit known, yet it was evident that its wider implications continued to occupy his singular mind.
"We have solved a crime, gentlemen, but in doing so we have had a glimpse into the machinery of a changing world. It is a machine of many moving parts, and I suspect we have not yet seen the half of its power, nor the full measure of those who seek to control it," observed Sherlock Holmes.
And as I watched him stare into the flames, I knew that for Sherlock Holmes the adventure of the politician's Pollen had concluded not merely with the capture of a criminal, but with the discovery of an entirely new and intricate problem to command his attention.